Ogundiran. This is the book, then a big volume, massive volume that was published in 2020 by Indiana University Press. The Yoruba, A New History is the first transdisciplinary study of the 2,000-year journey of the Yoruba people, from their origins in a small corner of the Niger-Benue confluence in present-day Nigeria to becoming one of the most populous cultural groups on the African continent, weaving together then archaeology with linguistics, environmental science with oral traditions, and material culture with a mythology. Ogundiran examines then local, regional, and even global dimensions of Yoruba history. Professor Ogundiran is Chancellor's Professor of History of Africana Studies, Anthropology and History at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. He is also a visiting professor at the University of Ibadan, Nigeria, and the editor-in-chief of the African Archaeological Review. Ogundiran's scholarship has focused primarily on the Yoruba world, Atlantic Africa, and the African diaspora. His research has been supported by several organizations, including the National Geographic Society, the American Institute of Archaeology, and the American Philosophical Society. He is also a past fellow of the National History Humanities Center, and his latest book is the book that we are discussing today. Kristin Mann, who is going to be commenting this session, is a professor emeritus at the Department of History of Emory University. Her work focuses on 18th through 20th century African history, gender, marriage and the family, slavery, emancipation and the slave trade, colonial, political and legal changes, and also West African commercial and agricultural transformations. She's the author of several books, including Slavery and the Birth of an African City, that is just here. 1760-1900, that was published in 2007. And this book was a finalist for the Gilder Lehrman Center's Frederick Douglass Prize. She's currently working on a project entitled Transatlantic Lives, Slavery and Freedom in West Africa and Brazil. Then Professor Ogundiran is going to present the book. After, you are going to have comments from Professor Mann, and then you are going to open for questions. You can ask your questions by raising your hands or doing this on audio or using also the chat to ask your questions. Professor Ogundiran, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Hannah. It's a real honor for me to be a guest of ASWAD, and I want to thank Hannah for organizing this. I know that she did it at very short notice, and that's why I call her that she's the only one that can pull this together like this, at the speed of light. And I also want to thank ASWAD for creating this forum to discuss academic books in African and African diaspora studies. Of course, many of you, all of you who are here, I really thank you. I'm really grateful that you've taken the time this evening, if you're on the East Coast, this afternoon, if you're on the West or far West, or if you're in Nigeria, very late in the evening. I can see some of you from Nigeria here at 10, it's already 10:30 there. So thank you all for making it. Of course, my scholarship is based on the work that many people before me have done, and this book would not have been possible without that scholarship. Of course, this book is based on my own primary research, but there's no way I could have written this without borrowing tremendously from the scholarship of many of you who are also here this evening. And of course, my colleagues who have helped me for so many years collecting data and allowing me to go to where I couldn't reach by myself. Okay, now let me give you a synopsis. And really, this is going to be a very brief because I want to hear from you. I don't need to introduce the Yoruba region, the geography to you, but you know, There are people who live present-day Nigeria, present-day Benin Republic, all the way to Togo. So 3 countries. That is their original homeland. And of course, they are found all over the world, including on this side of the lake. Now, it's crazy for someone like me to be saying that I'm writing a book, or that to have written a book published in 2020 on the Yoruba. It's a crowded field. Very, very crowded. And you can see some of the books that are historical texts that were written before my own book. And there are many others that are not here. So that writing a book of this nature requires new evidence, and also being able to uh, correct some things that we did not get right before. And that is the purpose of scholarship. That's why I call it a new history. Uh, Oftentimes, we think that we have resolved or some questions are settled, right? But a field archaeologist and a field historian like myself, we know very well that what is currently the wisdom of scholarship may turn out tomorrow to be not actually the old story. I just got some radiocarbon dates last week that I wish I had those dates going back to 300 BC as well, but in a place that I never expected I would find those kind of evidence, including terracotta figures that we didn't know exist in that part of Nigeria before. Now, that story doesn't change the storyline of this book. However, it's going to add another maybe chapter to the book in future. So that is the nature of scholarship. I did not set out to write this book. For those of you who know the kind of work I do, I am interested mostly in questions of regional interactions, community formation, social complexity, how states developed. So I've had the privilege to travel around Yoruba region for the past 30 plus years, starting as an apprentice scholar myself, and some of my professors are here, and then starting my own work as well in the last 25 years. These green buttons indicate where I've actually done extensive work, excavations and other things. And these blue buttons show where I've traveled to, collecting data over the past over the past 2+ decades. So it is in the process of doing research for this that I realized that the existing framework that I was using to interpret my data, my evidence, my data do not really fit this existing mode. Because sometimes after repeating things so many years, we tend to think that that is the truth. But new evidence sometimes will make us pause and say, maybe that is not exactly what happened. And that is how so that's why I decided to write this book. It is to align my data, to align my interpretation with data instead of fitting my data into the existing scheme of things. Most people know me as an archaeologist because that is perhaps because of the nature of archaeological work. I'm known for that. But really, I do more than doing archaeological work. I excavate temples. When I say excavate, not literally, in a kind of metaphorically. I spend a lot of time with priests and priestesses because I've always been drawn to Orisha epistemology, to rituals, and also to iconographies that are associated with these rituals. So in the process of studying rituals, studying Orisha epistemology, I realized that the Orisha epistemology itself is a very, very rich archival material that we historians need to pay attention to, and that we cannot write Yoruba history without taking Orisha epistemology seriously. Because this is the archive that the Yoruba have used for more than 2,000 years to store their history. So I also pay attention, of course, to everyday language use, oral traditions, And through my mentor, Professor Eret, who I believe is here, a very great friend and a very great scholar, he drew me into historical linguistics as well. Of course, I also use primary or published memoirs and travel accounts. Now, the reason why this eclectic use of sources are important in African studies, for those of us who are Africanists, we know this, but it's so important because for the Yoruba, it's only in the 19th century that they began to generate written documents by themselves. Between 1500 and 1800, we have to rely on what other people say about them, right? And so that if you're going to look at the deep history of the Yoruba, you really need to be eclectic in your use of sources. So by using all of this, I realized that the evidence does not fit the existing scheme of historical interpretation. So these are my points of departure in this book. I discovered that although Yoruba literature is very vast and perhaps represent one of the most canonical and groundbreaking works in African studies, we know very little about the deep history that defines the Yoruba experience. So that the period between 300 BC and the encounter with colonialism tend to be flattened into one historical layer. I also realized that there's a tendency to place Yoruba experience in Eurocentric periodization, and in a way that they obscure the actual experience of the Yoruba people, not just the Yoruba, I think many African groups as well. And then I'm trying to move away from a Yoruba historiography that is descriptive and non-theoretical. I try to move to a location whereby Yoruba epistemology drives the engine of historical interpretation. And lastly, I've discovered that the concept of nation, ethnicity, and tribe that European colonial rule imposed on the colonized peoples all over the world, these conceptual frameworks may be good and appropriate for studying the colonial and post-colonial period. They are totally inappropriate to use them for pre-19th century Yoruba history. So they here are points of destination. Theoretical. I'm a cultural historian by choice, so that combining the theoretical framework of hermeneutics and political economy have always been very important to the way I look at cultural formations and how societies and groups of people perform their history. I also tap from the cosmopolitan and universal framework of Orisha epistemology. This is very important. Then there are 4 pillars of Yoruba cultural identity that any scholar of Yoruba must pay attention to, not just in Africa, but also in the diaspora. The first is the Yoruba as a house society. Ile is the building block of Yoruba sociology. And if we don't pay attention to Ile, we are going to miss a lot of things. And I believe many scholars like Andrew Hapter and Olatunji Ojo and others, they've also mentioned the importance of Ile as the core sociological framework of Yoruba cultural formation. Then the twin concepts of divine kingship and urbanism, they define the ideology of governance and social organization among the Yoruba, especially since about 800 AD. So again, we cannot move away from this conjoined frameworks to understand Yoruba history. Then another concept that is driving wheel of this book is what I call gendered duality. This idea of co-equivalence of the male and female energies for creating social order is very paramount, is very fundamental to understand Yoruba cultural history. And the last one is what I call immortality. The search for meaning in social life that drives individual action, that makes the individual sees himself or herself as a potential Orisha. So the entire purpose of living is to attain immortality in Yoruba cosmology. But you achieve that only when you become an ancestor after passing on. The only group of people that actually achieve immortality when they are still living, they are the Yoruba kings, the divine kings. They are the only ones. But all other people, they achieve that. They aspire to achieve that immortality when they pass on. Then another point of destination in this book is what I call creating new chronotypes, new periodization for imagining the past, for understanding the past. And then instead of using the concept of tribe or nation, I use the open-endedness of this concept, community of practice, which many anthropologists have been using in the past decade or so. I find it very, very applicable to the Yoruba as a group of people, as an open society. And then another thing that is important in this book is how I'm able to relate Yoruba history to climate history. And perhaps this is the first time that we're able to link Yoruba history to about 2,000 years of climatic turbulence in West Africa. And then to also locate Yoruba in global and regional processes. Their trading networks with the Mande in Western Sudan, as well, of course, many of us know this with the Atlantic world. Then to look at the events and eventfulness that define their internal innovations in politics, technology, and religion. So this is a 10 chapter book, but really it's an 8 chapter book in the sense that the first chapter is an introduction, laying out my theoretical framework, which historians don't usually do this, but I chose to do it, and also to also lay out my methodology and my sources, how I came to know what I know. Then I move into looking at about uh, 1,000 years of history in chapter 2. There are some gaps that I hope future research will be able to fill there, but try to make sense of what I know now based on my different sources. And then I top that in chapter 3 with how the Yoruba became a community of practice. That's what I call the classic age of the Yoruba. But as the Yoruba will say, nothing lasts long. There's always, and the Yoruba also understand this in their epistemology, that life is curvy, it's not straight, and things up and down, So by about between 1400 and 1420, the Yoruba entered a period of atrophy. This is when political systems began to collapse in response to hemispheric climatic crisis, what we call the Little Ice Age. It translated into droughts, multi-decadal droughts in West Africa. But as those droughts were also happening, many political formations like Mali Empire also collapsed, giving birth to Songhai Empire. The entire Western Sudan was in turmoil between 1400 and 1500. So Ile-Ife Empire, the first empire in the Yoruba world, also declined at that time. So I try to explain that we cannot use one causative factor to explain what happened between 1400 and 1570. That we need to also pay attention to not only political crises, climatic crisis, but also episodes of what we are going through now. Pandemics also happened. So I explained that, and then in chapter 5, I I look at how communities also arose. Regenerated, created new society, and restored themselves. And that's when the Oyo Empire evolved around 1570, and then many other states developed around that time. Then, actually, the last 4 chapters of the book, the substantive chapters, talk about the impacts of merchant capital revolution on the Yoruba world. One of the things that many historians have debated for many years, and we are still debating it, is what made Africans engage in the slave trade. And I say, listen, it's very simple. Very simple. One word. For the Bat of Benin is tobacco. Tobacco addiction was the driving engine of the Atlantic slave trade in the Bat of Benin. So explain how I reached that conclusion. And of course, tobacco was not the only thing, especially tobacco coming from Brazil was not the only one, but it is the main driving engine of the Atlantic slave trade. So, and then I then look at the sociality of merchant capital, what I call the merchant capital that shaped how society was reorganized. And indeed, the entire Yoruba world, I mean, of course, many African world, Central and Western Africa world, they were reorganized between 1630 and 1840. And the consequence of that was what I call perennial inequality. Class structure developed to a point that it became difficult for society to move from one class to the other, especially from the lower class to the upper class. And that eventually led to a major crisis at the beginning of the 19th century. So I look at the impacts of that in chapter 9, that I titled A House Divided. So chapter 10, therefore, provides a kind of reflection for me to reflect about what all these 2,000 years of history meant for the Yoruba today. So that is how I ended the work. And this is just, I'm going to just show this periodization. I developed 8 periodic phases here for the Yoruba, that the people that I call the Proto-Yoruba, belonging to the pre-Archaic period, they evolved about 3000 BC. And this is so when I say the Yoruba, I'm talking about the language itself, right? The Proto-Yoruboid. But that period from 3000 to 300 BC, we don't know much about it. All I can say is that their descendants became prominent in what is now the Niger-Benue confluence in Nigeria, especially on the western side of the Niger-Benue confluence. But there was an event that triggered their migrations around 300 BC, and that was what I call the Big Dry, or what we call the Big Dry period in West African history. It's a very intense drought that lasted for about 600 years. And that is when the Yoruba expansion, their demographic expansion, took off, giving birth to what is now the Proto-Igala on the other side of River Niger, the Proto-Ishikiri on the coast, so that by about 600 AD, they've become, if not the largest, one of the largest cultural groups in West Africa. And then a stable climatic regime returned about between 250 and 300 AD. And that's when you begin to see the branching of Yoruba dialects as we know them. Now we have more than 35 Yoruba dialects. So what I've done in this book is to call our attention to the fact that the Yoruba as a people did not evolve in a big bang, event. That there is a process, like any other group, that produced them. And that process eventually led them to create certain new political innovations for which we know them today, right? So that by 650 AD, they were beginning to create a new political arrangements for themselves. And that culminated by 1000 AD in the beginning of what we call the classic Yoruba civilization, whereby the divine kingship, urbanism, manufacture of glass for the first time, the only group we know in Africa, south of the Sahara, producing glass, by 1000 AD, if not before. The Ife Empire developed. They created vast commercial networks. So all of these things were products of many centuries of experimenting, that eventually culminated in this. And then, of course, from 1400 to 1570s, that's what I call the intermediate period. And that's when I refer to the regional instability. that eventually led to the collapse of Ife Empire and led to the decline of so many other political formations, the displacement of so many people across the region. But then those people began to regroup about 150 years later. That is about 1570. That's when you begin to see some of the old kingdoms were being rebuilt. But as they were doing that, a new guest arrived on the coast. The Portuguese, the Dutch, and of course, they played their own role in what then eventually became the Atlantic Age Yoruba around 1630. So this is the outline of the book. I won't take much time because I want to hear what Professor Mann wants to say about the book and also what the audience would like to say. So let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Akin. And now let's have Kristin.
Thanks to ASWAD for hosting this event, to Ana Lucia for organizing it, to Professor Ogundiran for participating, to all of you for coming. I'm pleased and honored to be involved. Prof. Ogundiran has written a wonderful book from which I've learned a great deal. I'll use my time to discuss what I see as some of the Yoruba Anu history's major accomplishments and contributions, and I will cover some of the same ground that Prof did in talking about his book. I think that may be helpful to people who have not yet had the opportunity to read the book. In conclusion, I'll pose a question to a launch discussion. One of the book's greatest achievements is the long time period it covers within a single volume. The book begins in the pre-archaic period, 2500 to 300 BC, with the evolution around the Niger-Benue confluence of what Prof. Ogundiran calls the Proto-Yoruboid linguistic and cultural group. It then describes, analyzes, and interprets the expansion, evolution, and transformation of that population and its culture during the next 4,000 years. To tame this long past, to bring it under his control and to help make it comprehensible to readers, Prof periodizes it, deploying a technique familiar to archaeologists and historians. He divides the 4 millennia into 8 time periods, and he showed you the graphic outlining them, which were defined, each of which was defined by characteristics that gave it internal coherence and distinguished it from earlier and later periods. Very helpfully, the author introduces and summarizes this temporal schema in a table on page 7 of the book, and he showed you a slide of that table. Analysis of the key characteristics and major developments in each of these periods then structures the book. A second great contribution of the text is the holistic approach the author adopts to thinking about cultural change across the millennia. He integrates analysis of many different spheres, or of the many different spheres of human activity that constitute culture. Material processes are key in each period, not only the production and trade of agricultural commodities and craft items, but also the consumption of everyday and luxury goods. Prof discusses both the use and aesthetic value of material objects. At certain moments, however, it was breakthroughs in social organization, not material practices, that propelled development. In his third period, 250 to 750 AD, a time of stable rainfall and rapid population growth, families adopted a type of ile, house or household organization that effectively cared for their own members and promoted social reproduction through the propagation of new ideas about personhood, community, and the ancestors. Core values in this period included openness to outsiders, tolerance of diversity, paths to incorporation, as well as complementary and co-equal male and female spheres of activity and authority. In sum, inclusion. Prof's discussion of this cornerstone of Yoruba culture helped me better understand much I've read about more recent Yoruba history and better think about questions in my own current research, which focuses on the 19th century. The house system was so successful that by the late formative period, 650 to 1050 AD, incipient towns, populated by corporate kin groups of diverse backgrounds, had developed, creating a need for new kinds of leadership. Centralizing figures, Oba Lade, appeared. The author calls them divine kings in English. They and their associates created new political institutions and promoted new religious beliefs, ceremonial practices, philosophical ideas, and aesthetic values that integrated and amalgamated Ile into Ilu, larger scale units of social and political organization. The wearing of red beads imported from the north became a fundamental symbol of political authority and spiritual power. In this portion of the book, the focus shifts to politics, government, and the beliefs, rituals, and ideas that underpin them. Ile-Ife is the best known example of the emergence of the Ilu Oba Alade dyad, but the author argues that there were many such places between 800 and 1000 AD. Now, during the classical period, 1000 to 1420, innovations in what the author calls knowledge capital within Ile-Ife itself gave the kingdom an edge and enabled it to establish commercial, military, and political preeminence between the Niger and the Weme rivers. At that time, Ile-Ife came to be seen as the place of origin and point of reference for divine kingship and the community of practice that defined Yoruba cultural identity. Some of the important innovations were technological, as Prof mentioned. For example, entrepreneurs in Ile-Ife figured out how to manufacture beads, the main symbol of power and authority, out of glass using locally sourced materials. In this section of the book, we see Professor Ogundiran, the anthropologist and the material scientist, at work. The popularity of Ife beads spread rapidly among elites. Ife traders began selling them far and wide. The trade expanded Ife's commerce more generally, enriched the town, strengthened its military, and increased the prestige of its rulers. The arts flourished. Migrants seeking opportunity, security, and a cosmopolitan environment flocked to the growing town. Other innovations were ideological. Ife's rulers, priests, and artists spawned and spread oral traditions that legitimized Ile-Ife's preeminence via the claim that it was the source of divine kingship. They bound lesser polities to Ile-Ife by representing the relationship between them as filial, ebi, an idea with roots in the house system. The development of this new consciousness, Ogundiran argues, masked the hierarchy within the AB fraternity and contributed to regional integration. Still, other innovations were intellectual and religious. In these realms, leaders incorporated local Ife beliefs into widely held but slightly different regional ideas and repackaged them as universals. The author illustrates the process through discussions of Orunmila, or Ifa, and Obatala to show how the origins and genealogies of Ife deities and ancestors became a template for the Yoruba community of practice. This Ifa-centric Orisha field spread via overlapping economic, political, and social networks, along with the oral traditions mentioned a minute ago. A new worldview emerged which supported Ife's vision of regional economic and political integration and helped transform its preeminence into hegemony. I hope you can glimpse from my summary of a complex process how effectively Professor Ogundiran weaves together the economic, the social, the political, the ethnographic, the intellectual, the environmental, and much more to present a holistic view of Yoruba culture. Ife's dominance didn't last, as Prof said. An ecological crisis, long severe droughts, and associated famines and epidemics between about 400 and 1570 led to the collapse of the regional economy and decline of Ile-Ife and many other Yoruba kingdoms. The Ife Empire ended. Meanwhile, Nupe and other brigands swept south across the Niger and pillaged and plundered as far south as Ikiti. The 15th and 16th centuries were a terrible time for most Yoruba speakers. In 2021, in the midst of climate change disasters, serious food shortages, and a global pandemic, readers can, I think, really identify with what was going on at this time and how Yoruba speakers must have felt about it. During this period, people on the coast first encountered an expanding Europe. Ogundiran labels his final period, 1630 to 1840, the Atlantic Age, signaling the importance he attaches to the penetration of Atlantic merchant capital. The period began well with recovery and regeneration. Old kingdoms were rebuilt and new ones were founded. In the early years of the Atlantic encounter, the important importation of cowrie shells, a currency, monetized the economy, increased economic specialization, particularly in textile production, and expanded market exchange, though at a long-term cost. Oyo, the northernmost kingdom in the Yoruba community of practice, expelled brigands from across the Niger who had been terrorizing its population and became the dominant economic and political power. However, other warrior kingdoms also emerged and had capital cities with large, diverse, and highly skilled populations. Market towns on their frontiers, where peoples from across the region and beyond it traded, promoted what the author calls networked social and cultural economic integration. Prof. Ogundiran shows how the arts, sculpture, architecture, music flourished in Oyo-Ile and other capital cities. In this part of the text, we see Prof, the humanist, at work. In sum, the expanding Atlantic commerce at first increased the volume of production and trade domestically, although few people outside the political and military and commercial elites had the resources to consume the tobacco, cloth, spirits, and other goods introduced from across the sea. Meanwhile, the most successful warrior kingdoms, Oyo-Ile, Ilesha, Ijebu, redo the political map by waging wars of expansion and, in Oyo's case, establishing a new empire. Building on what had happened earlier in Ile-Ife, they introduced a powerful new symbol of political authority, the horse, and reworked the pantheon of Orishas by elevating Ogun, god of iron and warfare, to preeminence. These aesthetic, religious, and ideological innovations established a new worldview and naturalized the conquests of the warrior kings. Soon, the Atlantic encounter began to manifest darker sides. Local elites encouraged the monetization of cowries, but dependent on a currency that could only be acquired through transatlantic trade put them in a weak position. Prof, the economic historian, argues that in this period, Yoruba rulers had little control over fiscal policy. Moreover, cowries weren't a recognized international currency. The only way Yoruba rulers and traders could convert them into an Atlantic register of value was by investing in and indeed trading enslaved men, women, and children. Meanwhile, Yoruba culture was becoming increasingly commodity and object-oriented. The consumption of imported goods, textiles, tobacco, spirits, cowries spread and acquired new meaning in marking social distinctions and in object-centered sociality. Prof documents such changes in dress and personal adornment, ceremonial and ritual performances, as well as wonderfully in expressions of ideas about personhood and self-realization. Yoruba culture had come to be defined by the consumption of goods that could only be acquired through participation in the Atlantic slave trade. Furthermore, inequality had deepened and become perennial within the Oyo Empire and other hegemonic states such as Ilesha and Ijebu. In Oyo, the process played out in multiple contexts between Oyo and the tributaries it had conquered and colonized, where imperial agents imposed heavy imposts and seized men, women, and children for labor, marriage, or concubinage, and sometimes sale into the Atlantic commerce. Within the kingdom itself, between the capital city and the provinces, from which metropolitan administrators exacted taxes, labor, and services. Across all three domains, between ruling military and commercial elites, and many other inhabitants. On the one hand, there was a big increase in slave owning within the upper and middle strata of society, and more of the enslaved were female than male. The widespread employment of enslaved labor by elites heightened their advantages in production, trade, and reproduction. Furthermore, it was essential to imperial administration and military organization. On the other hand, those near the top of the social order also enjoyed advantages in the recruitment of freeborn wives for themselves, their sons, and their other dependents, leading to an expansion of polygyny. These two changes took place at a time when women, free and slave, bore the brunt of increased market production of many kinds and also dominated local and long-distance trade. The expansion of polygyny, Prof argues, undermined the status of freeborn wives and reduced the influence of matricentric spheres of authority while increasing that of patricentric spheres. These interconnected changes hardened inequality and undermined upward social mobility within households, across generations, and throughout the empire. They produced a permanent underclass in Prof's view and became a source of deep disaffection. The argument in this section of the book is complex, and I've condensed it almost beyond recognition. I hope we'll have time to discuss this constellation of ideas, that particularly his ideas about gender. Prof argues that the Yoruba's encounter with Atlantic merchant capital created new cleavages of class and gender. The story of the decline and fall of the Oyo Empire is the best known episode in Prof. Ogundiran's deep time history of the Yoruba. To the generally accepted causes, he adds the rebellion of underclass free people, as well as slaves, and renewed ecological crisis, particularly drought and famine. The collapse of the empire constituted, in Ogundiran's view, a cataclysmic breakdown of social order. The wars that accompanied it led to the destruction of thousands of towns and villages and permanent displacement of millions of people, about 500,000 of whom were sold into Atlantic slavery. As I conclude, I ask you to imagine, just pause for a minute and think about the wide range of sources Prof needed to use to write the deep time, holistic history of the Yoruba, about which he and I have spoken this afternoon. Think for a moment about the many complex methodologies he needed to master to evaluate and analyze such evidence. His impressive transdisciplinary approach to research represents a further dazzling accomplishment and contribution. To have woven together the pieces in a cogent and compelling narrative, lucidly and engagingly written, is quite wonderful and remarkable. I urge you to read the book if you haven't already. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Kristin, and thank you, Akin. We are now broadcasting on YouTube, and I'm happy that the problem was solved. You are going to upload the entire video there later, and we have already people asking questions in the chat here, and also I see someone, Kate Crawford, who has a question, and I will pass to him now.
Thank you and good evening. Are you able to hear me?
Very well.
Perfectly.
Great, thank you. First of all, congratulations, Dr. Akin, for this outstanding work. And I'm a little disappointed because I ordered mine a couple of weeks ago and I still haven't gotten it. So much for the mail system. But the question that I wanted to ask, you started off your talk describing some radiocarbon dates going back to 300 BC. And they sound like they're a pretty big deal because you wanted to add another chapter. So I'm just curious if you could describe what items or what type of technology or what aspect of society these dates relate to. And I'm keeping my fingers crossed, hoping that it relates to the use of metals or ironworking or something of that sort. But please go ahead and thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, my brother. It's nice seeing you. It's been a while. I've been working in Oyo Ile. This is the capital of the ancient Oyo Empire. The place is now, no one is living there. I mean, people are living there, but it's the big city that was Oyo Ile is no longer there. So we started working there about 5 years ago. And in the last 3 years, we have been focusing our attention on the pre-Oyo Empire period. See, many of us, we know Oyo Empire, but we don't really know what preceded it. And I wasn't expecting anything that would go beyond, let's say, 12th, 13th century. But we have 4 radiocarbon dates now in a very, very well dated stratigraphy, taking us back to 300 BC. This period is very critical in the history of many West African peoples because it's like a transitional period between what we call the later Stone Age and the early Iron Age. It's very important. It's also a period that is associated with the major climatic change stretching from 300 BC to 300 AD. So we are still trying to make sense of this period, but we found that human burial there. We have iron as well, and then their pottery indicates that these were not people who are just trying to learn how to do things. They have good experience and very good grasp of the technology. And also we found one terracotta figure is the only place in that region where a terracotta figure has come from. So this is, I didn't mean to give you some bones, but that's all I can say for now, because we are still trying to process what this means, because it is changing my assumptions, it is changing my hypothesis, and I have to come up with new explanations. Okay, so yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry, thank you so much. We have questions in the chat as well. But okay, we have one question here then from Pelumi. Let's go, Pelumi. You can go ahead and mute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everybody. I find myself quite lucky to be part of this experience. I just saw the advert online, I think on Facebook, and then I registered. I didn't know that it's going to be a webinar that will have the likes of Professor Tony Falola and many other important scholars I'm seeing here today. I'm glad to be part of this experience. And I'm also glad to have an encounter with Professor Ogundiran, with whom I have interacted copiously on Facebook. I'm glad I'm encountering him now. Of course, I read some pages of his text. I read it along with Adeleke Adieko's The Art of Being Yoruba. Of course, the two of them are saying, something entirely, or not entirely, something largely different, while Ogundiran focuses on Yoruba territory particularly. And ultimately, what Adieko does is to look at the Yoruba phenomenon beyond the Yoruba soil, the Yoruba diaspora. And I find it quite interesting that Ogundiran engages the Yoruba Empire, and then he also delves into Ile-Ife, which is a strong concern to me. I know he studied at Ife. He also studied at Ibadan. Of course, a few weeks ago, I did not read that article. Neither was I part of that gathering. But I saw it posted on social media that he made a presentation a few weeks ago on Yoruba diaspora, and this leads me to my immediate question. My question now, with interest in Ile-Ife, is what is the significance? What do you consider? Coming from the context of Yoruba, a new history, what do you consider as the significance of Ile-Ife in engagement of Yoruba diaspora? The Yoruba diaspora and direct or indirect influence of Ile-Ife on contemporary Yoruba diaspora. That's my point. That's my question. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Well, before the Yoruba diaspora in the Atlantic world was constituted, Ile-Ife had established itself as the most important place in the Yoruba world. So within Africa, Ile-Ife was already important. You see, we don't give a lot of credence to how ancestral Africans created social order. We tend to think that social order was something that was new, that we have to read the Enlightenment before we know what social order was. No. Ile-Ife engineered itself as the beginning and the end of time. Let's pause for that statement. The beginning and the end of time. Not many places in the world succeeded in creating itself, like so that for you as an individual, you can only think of it when you think of yourself, you think of Ile-Ife as the beginning, and that when you pass away, that you will return to Ile-Ife. That is for a society, for a place to create that sensibility in a vast territory beyond Yoruba territory, going all the way to Edo speaking people, the Benin people. That, we have to ask the question, how did they do it? And that's what I try to answer in this book. So by the time the diaspora, the Atlantic Yoruba diaspora developed, their ancestors already knew that Ile-Ife was the beginning and the end of time. So Ile-Ife played a role in ideology, in creating an ideology, in creating an ideology of who you are, in creating an ideology of where you are going. And I think that is the glue that pull all the Yoruba speaking peoples together since about 1100 AD. Ile-Ife was the cultural, ideological, philosophical glue, epistemological glue, so to say. So not because many people from Ile-Ife arrived in the diaspora. In fact, there were very, very small number of people from Ile-Ife arrived in the diaspora. Most people came from Western Yoruba region, Oyo, Awori, and other areas. But those people already knew about Ile-Ife. They were already part of this cosmological network that privileged Ile-Ife as the center of the universe. So in the diaspora, therefore, Ile-Ife continues to have that pull on people's mentality, on people's psychology, as well as in their religious belief system. I hope
Thank you. Thank you. We have a question from Professor Paul Lovejoy. Please unmute yourself, Paul. Here you are.
Prof, thanks. Thanks very much for your talk, and Kristin, thanks very much for your commentary. I appreciate both, especially since I haven't read the book yet, although I certainly know Prof's work very well, and I'm very much looking forward to it. My question really is directed at, in the commentary, at least on the book, there was no, I don't think I heard any reference to Islam. And I'm wondering about your periodization. And my own concerns, as you well know, is your last period that you're interested in. And I'm particularly interested in the impact of the jihad in the Yoruba region. Yeah. And indeed, I would date the beginning of the collapse of Oyo to the jihad impact in Nupe in 1810, 7 years before Ilorin. Mm-hmm. But I appreciated the theoretical framework and the overview. I appreciated very much the discussion of the economics. I think I'll look at those sections much more carefully when I actually look at the book. But for now, I'd really like to hear, as we all know, that the name Yoruba itself is a Muslim name. It's a Hausa name, it's a Songhai name, it's an Arabic name. And why it was that Christian converts decided that they were going to develop this as the colonial ethnonym of course, is a huge literature on that. But the Islam factor is hidden again and again. What's the connection between Ifa divination and Islamic divination systems? All kinds of things that come up that would suggest to me that I'd like to hear what you think about Islam.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. I really appreciate you joining us this evening. Thank you a lot for that comment. Yes, Islam. Islam has been part of the Yoruba for, I would say, for most of their history, really, especially from 11th century AD, because they were trading with Muslims by that time. But Islam was not domesticated in the Yoruba world at all until early 19th century. They were aware of Islam. They traded with Islam. They even recruited Muslims into their midst. But Islam was not domesticated. It wasn't integrated into the Yoruba pantheon, because that pantheon continues to drive the epistemology of the society. I don't. One of the things I discuss in this book is this controversy that we have about the origin of the Yoruba word, Yoruba. It is not an Hausa word. The Hausa were not the first to use that term. The Songhai were the first to write it down, and that's a big difference. And the Yoruba became known more in the Western Sudan, especially after the collapse of Ile-Ife, because many Yoruba were actually sold into slavery in the 15th century. In the 15th century, they were sold into slavery in Central Sudan as well as in Western Sudan, and that is when the word Yoruba developed. But I argue in the book that Yoruba came from the word Yagba. Yagba are the largest Yoruba subgroup in North Central Yoruba. And that group was also the main victims of Nupe incursions that brought the Yoruba into the Sahara. So Yagba is where Yoruba came from. Not when you talk to the Nupe, they will say Yaba or Yabanchi, but as the word moved further away from the source, it became Yoruba in Songhai. So the Hausa came across the word Yoruba through the Songhai. They did not create that word. So, but there are many Muslim women who are wives of the political elite of Oyo, who are mothers of many Alafi between 1570 and 1800. Many of these women were Hausa or other groups from Central Sudan. So, and in fact, we are now excavating some of the residencies of some of these enslaved people who are in Oyo as well. So what you see is that there were many Muslims within the capital of Oyo. They were allowed to practice their religion, and the Yoruba were aware of that. But Islam did not play a direct role in the Yoruba religion until the 19th century. So what you are referring to as the jihad, as jihad, yes, it affected the Yoruba, but I took a different approach to my interpretation of what happened in 1817. It was not only an Muslim revolt. It was a class revolt. And your book on the age of revolution, that many students have not taken Africa seriously in discussing the age of revolution. Although I did not cite a book in your book in my book, because I did not digest it before I finished this book, but later I read it. Yes, you are right there about the importance of jihad. But many Yoruba were already Muslims. I mean, especially in Oyo in the early 19th century, and they joined non-Yoruba Muslims in the revolt. So the revolt of Oyo in 1817 that really brought the empire on its knees it was not just Islam. It was not an Islamic revolt. I call it a class revolt. It was a class struggle, and we need to pay attention more to class as a substance of analysis in African history. So so I mean, I don't think I have more to say beyond that. That it was not a it later jihad hijacked Sokoto Caliphate tried to hijack what happened in 1817. Gwando Emory tried to hijack it through Ilorin, but originally it was a class revolt. It was not an Islamic revolt.
Thank you. We have 3 questions, 2 people raising their hands, but it has have also a question coming from the chat that I'm going to read for you. It comes from Leo Correa, and the question is, what does it mean Yoruba diaspora regarding the permanence or the heritage from Yoruba culture in the Americas, Brazil, Caribbean, and the United States? What does it make the connection then of so many different countries even today?
Deep question. What does it mean?
It's broad. What does it mean, all these connections? Well, you're free to speculate.
Yeah, well, I mean, considering the fact that being a Yoruba is not about genetic identity, it's about cultural identity. The way I interpret the Yoruba diaspora is anyone who subscribes to Yoruba epistemology, Yoruba religion, Yoruba ways of life is a Yoruba. Now, when you are not in the ancestral land, you are outside that space, including myself, then you become a Yoruba diaspora, right? But it's not, it's more than being born a Yoruba. It's a lifestyle. And I think my community of practice framework is expansive enough to accommodate that kind of reality that people live. That it is not racial, it is not ethnic, it is none of all those things. It is a practice. So and these people have created very, very healthy, very solid networks among themselves in the diaspora as well as in Africa. In fact, when as a scholar of Yoruba studies, you have to pay attention to what the Yoruba diaspora in Brazil, in Cuba, in Trinidad, what they are writing about the Yoruba. We have to pay attention to that because they are part of the dialogue about the history, about religion, about culture, about the epistemology. And that's where the debates always come. Oh, what is authentic and what is not authentic? Listen, there's no authentic culture, right? Culture is always made up. So that's why we're having that kind of debate. But people are participating in being Yoruba and becoming Yoruba, irrespective of geography. And they are creating social networks as well with the homeland and even within the, I mean, from Miami to where I live in Charlotte, there's a vast network of communication and interaction going on about African diaspora, about Yoruba diaspora, and that stretched all the way across the pond as well. So that's the best I could do answering that question.
Thank you so much. We have a comment that I'm going to read from the chat. This book, I could not stop reading it once I started. Then courtesy of Professor Ogundiran's captivating style. This is a comment coming from Adesoji Adesina. She's saying that he must be applauded not only as an historical masterpiece on the Yoruba speaking peoples, but it seems to me that it carries significant implications for technological and theological contributions of this culture. For example, I am curious as a chemical engineer, whether we have some idea based on archaeological data on the processing conditions of the fair residents used in the glass and Akin red beads production. Any evidence for ceramic, furnace, or similar devices in possible locations? Then this is one question. Then we have another question from Titi Adewale. There is a theory that Yoruba was derived from Horus, and Ba is those whose ancestors Ba were descendants of the Egyptian god Horus. Have you heard of that, and what is your response? And I put these two questions together because then you have three more, and I think that you have to stop by there, unless you want to continue. I am ready for it, but go ahead, please.
Okay, well, let me answer the second question quickly. The Yoruba as a language group, they were developing about the same time that ancient Egypt was developing. So I don't see any direct connection between the two. So I've heard this story about Ba before, but there is no direct connection between the ancient Egypt and the Yoruba. Regarding glass, yes, we have abundant evidence of glass debris in Ile-Ife. Millions of crucibles, not just thousands, millions are in Ile-Ife. If you go to Igbo Lokun today, the perhaps the first industrial center in West Africa, you will see millions of broken glass vessels there up to today, crucibles. One of my students and also now a colleague, Dr. Babatunde Babalola, has done extraordinary work in Ile-Ife, where he was able to actually demonstrate the stages of glass manufacture in Ile-Ife. In my own work in the nearby Osogbo, we've also been able to decode the chemistry of glass, which I call Yoruba glass. It's a very unique chemistry in the world of glass. It has high lime, high alumina. That is a kind of a geochemical statement to make. But that particular chemistry is unique. It's different from what you find in Egyptian, Islamic, Greek, or Chinese glass. So Yoruba glass has distinctive chemistry based because they were using their own local materials to produce glass.
Thank you so much. You have now three questions in a row, and there are already people asking for a second part of this discussion on
I'm
the
ready
book.
for it.
I'm ready as well. Let's go ahead. We have Desi Usman, please. You can unmute yourself.
Okay, Professor Ogundiran. So I have to commend you for the efforts you've taken with this book, because you are focusing rather on a very difficult period. This is the period where we don't really have much information, but at least you dealt with it. So I must commend you for that. My question must have probably been answered during the session with Professor Lovejoy. And I'm actually wondering, because you've told us a very long chronological period of the existence of Yoruba. And as you know, the time when people start using the term Yoruba, at least according to scholars, it was relatively recent. So I don't know if you can be specific as at what point in time can we actually start using the word Yoruba culture. So I don't know whether you can actually pinpoint a time where the Yoruba culture becomes relevant.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, the word Yoruba was first encountered in writing in the 16th century, right? When a Songhai scholar wrote it down. Now, for him to have written it down in the 16th century, we can only assume that it was already existing, maybe 10 years before that, maybe 5 years before that, maybe 100 years before that. But it's not surprising that people who encountered Yoruba-speaking peoples gave a name to them through writing, right? Because they were not writing their own history, right? So, and again, it's through Islam, through an Islamic scholar of Songhai background, who was trying to make a case to his North African Muslims, who who deserve to be enslaved and who should not be enslaved. He himself is a Muslim who was enslaved in North Africa, and he was trying to make a case that he should not have been enslaved. But those Yoruba people could be enslaved because they are not Muslims. See, so it was in the 16th century. But don't forget also that the Yoruba-speaking peoples were already in Western Sudan as traders, as diplomats, as sometimes maybe enslaved. The same way maybe some Western Sudanese were enslaved among the Yoruba as well. So a movement of people back and forth was already happening from at least 9th century AD. We are now finding kola nuts in archaeological context in Gao and Timbuktu. Kola nut in the 9th century. So if kola nut from the forest could reach that place, so we can only imagine how long trading networks were happening between the rainforest where Ile-Ife and other most Yoruba people were and Western Sudan. So the idea of Yoruba is not surprising that it was already there in the 16th century, but I suspect it was there before 16th century. It's only that we came across it in writing in the 16th century. So it's not that recent, but but the use of it as a generic name for all Yoruba speaking peoples took off in the 19th century by the Yoruba people themselves. So the name originally did not refer to Oyo as we have been told in the historiography. No, the Oyo were very late in being called the Yoruba because they were not significant in the realm of interregional trade until the late, actually until the early 17th century. But there were other groups, Yagba, Ile-Ife, Igomina, where you do your work as well, that have been in part of that regional network of trade. So I think the name must have been older than the 16th century, but it was already written down in the 16th century. Thank you for that question. Yeah.
Thank you. We have two questions that were already responded, but I will just emphasize, evoke them. Yvonne Captain, she mentioned 1630 to 1840. I hope you can speak of the Yoruba in the New World, especially with the emphasis, on Shango in Cuba and Brazil. Also, Aderonke Adesanya, he is asking, or she is asking, I'm sorry, how is your explanation to Ile-Ife as the epicenter of the world, the beginning and the end of time, related to the concept of Oria de Ki Sumita? And this, it was already somewhat discussed. Is every Yoruba expected to key into this concept? Now we have two questions still coming from then people who are raising their hands. Then I would ask that we take these two questions together, and Akin can answer them in one shot before we finish. And people are already asking for a second. Then we are going to think about a second edition of this meeting.
Okay. Well, Shango is one of the deities in Yoruba pantheon that was very prominent in the diaspora. And the reason is simple. I would say more than half of the Yoruba who arrived in the 19th century in the New World, they were coming from areas under Oyo influence, where Shango was as the patron deity of the empire itself, as the patron deity of the Alafin. Shango was already more or less a universal deity, especially in Western Yoruba world under Oyo Empire. So it makes them, and many enslaved people in the 19th century, they were Oyo speakers, right? So it makes sense, therefore, that Shango and not Ogun became very prominent in the diaspora at that time. But of course, another deity that became very prominent would be Osun, Yemaya as well. Yemaja, because they were the anti-imperial deities in Yoruba world. You know, Osun and the Yemaja, not only because they were women, but also these two deities came from the territories into which Oyo expanded. right? And so they were anti-imperial deities. And that's why, so one thing we have to bear in mind is that in many African societies during this period, there were active conversations and debates going on. One of those debates is, what does it mean to be a person? When it became possible that a human life can be exchanged for commodities, an intellectual society will ask that question: that what does it mean, after all, to be a person? So that debate was going on. Okay, and we know the debates were going on because when we paid attention to the mythologies in Orisha pantheon, we see those debates going on. It's there. Likewise, people were also asking questions about freedom because they were burdened by the demands that Oyo Empire was making on them for taxes, for tributes, and also for labor. So there were struggles happening within Oyo Empire itself about freedom. So and we see this also translated into the Odisha, because this is the only source that the Yoruba knew to argue their case among themselves, to debate one another, and to also resist. So this is not surprising, therefore, that Shango became very prominent in the diaspora, as Oshun and the Yemaja also became very prominent. Regarding Ile-Ife, I think I answered that question already. I won't go through. Thank you for asking that question. It's an important Ile-Ife is an important place. No matter how we call it and dice it, it's an important place, because that is how the people of disparate backgrounds, speaking different dialects, mutually intelligible, of course, and of course several kingdoms. I mean, hundreds of kingdoms. It was the glue that pulled them all together. And that is the reason why Ile-Ife is very important in my story.
Thank you. We have a question, and I will ask then Olowasola to unmute and to ask the question. And then we have one more question, and then you are going to conclude, and you are going to think about the second edition of this discussion.
Yes. Good evening, everyone from Nigeria. I'm glad to be part of this meeting. I'm speaking from Adekunle Ajashi University. And I want to really thank Professor Akin Ogundiran for the publication of his book. I've always been eager to read something new about Yoruba. And why is that? Because from the time I've started, studying history, I've discovered that, some parts of Yoruba have really been missing in Yoruba epistemology. For instance, when you're talking about Northeastern Yoruba, like you mentioned the other time, you said something about Yagba, but I've not really seen so much on Akoko. And Akoko is a Yoruba subgroup of over 40 towns and villages. So it puzzles me sometimes when I read books and I don't really see so much in it, because I discovered that area has a lot to offer on Yoruba culture, on Yoruba art. So when you were, doing your presentation the other time, you said something about, you gave a slide showing the places you've been to in Yoruba land, and you gave your green light on Owo, on Ose and Benin. So, and Akoko is actually between those areas. So I really want to know how we can, construct or integrate Akoko to the act of being Yoruba, and how that's, how especially how interesting that part of Yoruba is to the history of Yoruba. And I really wish to see that invisibility of Akoko, to fade out in time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. In my book, I mentioned that the book is not about talking about all the kingdoms in Yoruba land, because I would never finish that book. I mean, it's impossible. But at the same time, I try to highlight places in the Yoruba region that have been neglected from historical research, especially pre-19th century historical research and archaeological research. For example, I make the argument, and I know it is controversial, that Ile-Ife itself is a product of Ekiti cultural universe. I know it is controversial, but today, that is what my evidence tells me. It doesn't diminish from Ile-Ife. I've not been to Akoko, I'm sorry. I've never been there, but I do know the importance of that region. You see, you cannot understand how the Yoruba arrived on the Atlantic coast and Ishekiri and other without focusing on Akoko. Akoko is very important. And I hope my book will provide the stimulation for younger scholars to really pay attention, to begin to take on these other areas that have been neglected. Many of us have focused on the major areas, or your Ile-Ife, and that's it. We need more people. I was studying. I mean, I did research in Ekiti, and there are many ancient cities. You can walk 1 to 2 kilometers in the bush. They are no longer existing, and you come across archaeological sites. I mean, 2 kilometers. Tell me, how many towns in Ekiti today are up to 2 kilometers in size? There are very few. But there were major kingdoms in Ekiti land, in the past that were very vast. So, and I'm sure in Akoko as well, there will be some. So we need more work. And with that kind of work, I can bet that this book will be revised because we're going to come across new materials that we did not know exist before. So,
thank you. We have one more question from Oyeronke. Please, you can unmute yourself.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, my sister.
Hi, Professor Ogundiran.
Thank you.
Yes. My question and critique, I'll try not to be long-winded, will not surprise you because I had articulated that critique when I did a review of the book at the Lagos Studies Association.
Yes.
Okay, to get right down to it, you make the point that there are 4 principles that shaped Yoruba identity. And the first one, of course, is the Ile. And then the third one, which is the one I'm most focused on, is the whole issue of gender duality. And I'm actually going to say that the Ile and gender duality should not be separated. What evidence do you have for gender duality in Yoruba culture? The Ile, that is your first principle, within the Ile, there are no gendered categories, and I insist on it, okay? There are no gendered categories within the Ile. And then you go on to talk about gender duality as part of the epistemological framework. And my question is, what is your evidence of this gender duality? You go on to talk about the Ogboni as a good example of gender duality, male and female. And I challenge that because indeed, when you look at the statue at Itayemo that you made called an example of gender duality, it is actually about Omo Oya, which is how Ogboni people refer to each other, not as male and female. They refer to one another as children of the same mother. So without further ado, in my work, I have argued and shown that the reason why Yoruba culture precisely cannot be a gender duality is because of the category of motherhood from which that Omoya derived. There's no binary, there's no gender binary. In fact, motherhood is the key to a whole lot of things about Yoruba epistemology. The cult of motherhood is foundational to existence. It is all pervasive. And that is what the statue at Itayemo to exhibit. And when we look at the categories within the Ile, as you said, they are not gendered categories. So I don't know how you arrive at gender duality. Finally, let me say, and I want to put this on the table because I have encountered it in the work of other Yoruba scholars, your failure to deal with issues of gender, your failure to read the work of gender, the whole idea of brushing aside the recent work that we've done on gender is part of the problem. There's nothing inherent in gender. It is theorized, it is socially constructed, and if you don't pay attention to the categories, especially as Yoruba society have taught us that most of our social categories are not gender specific, we will have this problem. So I have real problems with your notions of gender duality. And as a friend of mine just sent a WhatsApp, how can you translate a B as fraternity? That is part of the problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your comments. I really appreciate it. And as you very well know, your work is one of the most important work in Yoruba studies. And I've been influenced as well by your work, and I appreciate your comments. I think we maybe now it may appear as if we are saying different things, but I hope that as we continue to engage one another, we will realize that we are not that far apart. And thank you for sending me the PDF copy of your book, which I did not read before. While I was working on this book on motherhood. I appreciate it, but I also disagree with you, with all due respect, that the Yoruba Register of Social Organization was motherhood. It was more than motherhood. There was fatherhood, there was sisterhood, there was brotherhood. A society, again, I am not looking at contemporary society. I was looking at 2,000 years of history. And for a society that was operating at different levels of social organization at different times, we would not expect them to use one register of social organization, because it will not work. Now, at the beginning of the book, I make the case that the Yoruba people are like many other Niger Congo peoples. They were matrilineal in the beginning of time. I mean, that is around 300 BC. They were actually women were not raised. I mean, girls were not raised to become wives, as I said in my book, and boys were not raised to become husbands. No, women were raised to become mothers, and boys were raised to become fathers, and that their practice, or what we call marriage today, it was that a man will move into his partner's house. It was matrifocal. But as time went on, by the time the Yoruba were now developing city-states, things began to change. You begin to see emphasis on gender duality, and so that the idea of gender duality took off around 800 AD, when they were creating large-scale political formations. But you see, this idea is not, we don't need to go too far. It's written all over Yoruba sociology. Why do we refer to Alaafin, for example, as Iku Baba Yeye? That why is it that you as a female, as you very well know, you are you're a social male in your father's house. I mean, why? But you're also a biological a female. So why? So this is not surprising that we have this gender duality embedded in each and every one of us. So and you refer to Ogboni. When the Ogboni say Omo Iya, it doesn't translate into children of the same mother, literally. Ogboni, as I said in our first conversation about this, refers to indigenous, that Ogboni is about children of the soil, children of the land, children of the earth. So it does not relate, it does not refer to motherhood. It refers to that we are kinsmen, we are kinswomen, we belong to the same thing. So motherhood, therefore, should not be used as the only register for social organization among the Yoruba. And in fact, I did not brush aside gender in this book. Gender is, I don't think any book ever, which I mean, historical book of this nature, has taken gender as seriously as I have done. But also, I have, see, I am as an anthropologist as well. When you say Ebi means kings, right? Kinship. I am arguing in this book, or I argue in this book, that kinship is more than biology. Anthropologists always joke that every kinship is fictive. When we say fictive kinship, kinship means that you bring people in who are strangers and then who eventually become members of the house, members of the family. And that kinship is also class-based. Not everyone in the in the family has the same rights. We have alpha families. We have elite families within the kinship. And there were also people who are subservient, I mean, or who are secondary. So kinship is not about equality, social equality. It's in fact about a way of masking inequality at times. So fraternity is, and so I use the term fraternity when I'm referring to the relationship between the Yoruba kings who have created ideology of kinship. It's a fraternity, because nothing stops you as a member of an Ile, as a member of a kinship, to move away and join another family, or move away to yeah, someone's talking about Ajogbe, Ajobi, Ajogbe. Yes, you know, that's what kinship is all about. Ajogbe means to live together. So there's blood relationship, there's also fictive. So all of them work under the disguise of being of the same blood, but that doesn't mean that they belong to the same blood. So, my apology if you feel I've not taken gender seriously. I've tried to actually center gender, maybe not the way you like. That's okay. But I hope that as we begin to have this conversation, we'll find a common ground. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Akin and Kristin. I would give you then 1 minute, 2 minutes to wrap up, because we needed to finish. And I take the call for a part 2 of this discussion. The audience is still very engaged, and this is a big book that needs more discussion. Then Kristin, I don't know if you would like to say some final words.
Well, you know, I so appreciate this conversation, and I've learned so much from it. The book resonated very powerfully with me, you know, in part because of my interest in Yoruba history. But also in some way, it seemed to be a book for our time. It's written in a very contemporary idiom. I was interested in the choice of vocabulary. It was almost kind of hard for me to imagine. You must have started this book a good bit before 2020, but yet the language in the book seems to speak to so many Yoruba, historical, but also global concerns. And I guess I was curious about your choice of language and your choice of vocabulary. I mean, we read about technological edges. We read about, I don't think you use climate change, but you talk a lot about ecological crisis. And, I don't think you actually use the phrase loss of trust in government after you talk about perennial inequality, but you illustrate loss of faith in political institutions, loss of faith in leaders, loss of faith in government. And so I read the book and I thought this is just a wonderful work on Yoruba history, but it's also a work of, it also speaks to our time. And so I would just end with that comment. And I was very curious about your choice of language, and that you used language that is vocabulary that's really pretty timely.
Well, I don't know why I chose those words, to tell you the truth. But at the same time, I was conscious of trying to use words that captures the experiences I'm trying to describe, not necessarily to make it relevant to the present. I don't think that was my concern. My concern is to make my choice of words resonate with how the people themselves will have expressed them. Of course, I was writing in English, but I was translating what I was hearing from my informants, my teachers, these people, these priestesses, these priests, these local intellectuals, what they were telling me. I was trying to translate those things into English, and I think that's why sometimes I use Yoruba phrases, but of course I translate it also into English. So I was just trying to be conscious of conscientious about what the people themselves, how would they have described the experience they were going through, which I was trying to explain or interpret.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Then I would like to thank Professor Mann, Professor Ogundiran for this excellent discussion. And once again, to remind you that the book that you are reading today is The Yoruba, A New History by Akin Ogundiran, published in 2020 by University of Indiana University Press. And this is an event sponsored by the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora, ASWAD. Perhaps you are going to have a second part of this discussion, but now I want to pass the floor to my co-ASWAD, then my colleague from ASWAD. Let me just add her here, Laurie Lambert, and she will give some announcements of what is coming next for ASWAD.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's event. I just want to let you know about our next event in the book series by ASWAD. And we'll be featuring Catarina Gonzalez Seligman and her book, Writing the Caribbean in Magazine Time. It's just come out with Rutgers University Press. And this will be on Tuesday, September the 28th from 12:30 p.m. to 1:30 p.m. We will be sharing information on how you register on our social media channels. So please follow us on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. It's our handle is @ASWAD Diaspora. We'll also have this information posted on our website very soon. That's aswaddiaspora.org. I also want to take this time to remind everyone that we are really excited to have our virtual symposium this year. So please mark your calendars for November 4th to 6th. It's an entirely virtual symposium featuring scholars from across the diaspora, and we'll be sharing more information on that in the next few weeks. So again, please follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram @ASWAD Diaspora, or visit our website, aswaddiaspora.org, for more information on our upcoming events and especially our virtual symposium from November 4th to 6th. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Then I would like to thank everybody who came today here and continue following us. And especially I would like to thank Professor Ogundiran. Let me just add the spotlight here, and also Professor Mann for participating in this discussion. Thank you to all who attended this session. And stay healthy, stay safe, and come back for the next ones. Thank you.
Thank you.
And don't forget to buy the book, please. That is, we still have time to assign this book for those of you who are teaching this fall and next spring. Thank you.
Thank you, Ana Lucia.
Thank you, Ana Lucia.
This was great. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Excellent.
Valeu.
Tá bom.